So I'd like to just echo Jim's thoughts and thank you all for coming today. I know it's a commitment to spend a day away, but I think that hope that you're going to find today useful. There's a number of very interesting things that we're going to talk about. I wanted to jump on one thing that Jim said about this security in the boardroom. There are a number of things happening. I've probably talked to 24 boards, briefed 24 boards over the past couple of years. And I think the number there, that Jim's number, that 2/3 of board members feel like they don't have a clue, is maybe even a little bit low from the ones that I've talked to. It has been most boards, and I think we share some of that responsibility, those of us in the security community, because we have, for the longest time, almost talked down to our board members from a security perspective, from the saying that, you know, this is too complex and too sophisticated, we'll take care of it, you worry about your other risk things, all those other risks Jim talked about. So it's time for us to push that conversation back up to the board. And I am pleased today to have this very astute group of panelists. We have a CISO at a large bank, we have a consultant at a large consulting company, a CTO, and a vendor, a technology vendor. So it's a really good mix of panelists here. And to start, I would like to just have each of you take 30 seconds, 60 seconds, tell a little bit about you and your company and what you do. And start with you, Deb.
All right, I'm Deborah Guild. I work for PNC Bank. I'm the Chief Security Officer. In that role, I'm responsible for cybersecurity, fraud, and physical security. I started in the role in February of this year. Prior to that, I was actually the Chief Technology Officer, so ran the infrastructure, the data center, mainframe, mid-range network components. Prior to that, so I've been with PNC for 4 years. I spent 21 years at another financial institution called Bank of America. Spent a little bit of time also at Intel here in the Bay Area in my early 20s. So if you hear any stories about a blonde girl named Quackenbush, it wasn't me. And I'm real pleased to be here and to be part of the dialogue today.
Thank you.
Vijay, Jajoo. I'm a partner at KPMG's cybersecurity practice, focused primarily on internet companies, from the strategy, architecture, implementation, and when all things don't work, what do you do in terms of the breach response? So, and often talk to the board members on a very regular basis. And the good thing is in the Valley, this is top of the mind. So excited to be here.
Good morning. My name is Joe Gottlieb. I lead corporate development for Sailpoint. We're an identity governance vendor. What does that mean? We really help the largest enterprises control who has access to what. So getting back to the source and really wrapping all these target systems and their authorization models with policy and the workflow needed to approve those things. So pushing that back down to the business in a way that's scalable and presents a business interface so you can really control who has access to what. And that turns out to be, sadly, still not a very proactive effort on far too many companies' points of view, right, in terms of really seizing control of that and taking the steps needed to be proactive and vigilant there.
Brad Hibbert, so the VP of Strategy and the CTO for BeyondTrust. So we focus on really two areas. One is reducing attack surface on the vulnerability side from sort of external hackers and so on. And the other is on internal risks with respect to access. So making sure that when people have access, they're doing the right things with that access, using it appropriately, looking out for misuse and so on. It's really about the privileged access, the administrators of the systems and so on that we go after. And we find that that's really a missing layer of security within the security layers today. And so happy to be here. We're talking to CISOs all the time with our company, so hopefully I can bring a bit of a different perspective to the conversation.
So a little more backdrop, and maybe to add a little bit of gravity to this, is I did a quick search last week for another talk, and there are as of last week, there are 127 pieces of legislation in the House and Senate at the federal level that deal with cybersecurity. So legislators are very, very concerned about that, and that should concern every one of us in the room, because legislators like to legislate. And in fact, and very specific to this issue, Senate Bill 536, the Cybersecurity Disclosure Act of 2017, is specifically directed to publicly traded companies that says you must have someone on your board with cybersecurity expertise, or if you don't, tell us who is advising the board on cybersecurity. So This bill was actually introduced in the 114th Congress last year. It's back this year. Whether it gets any traction or not, but I think it explains the gravity of this conversation that we're having, and perhaps some of the other impetus that's pushing it along. So Vijay, I want to start with you. One of the things that we have, as CISOs and security professionals, have dealt with a long time is, the Wall Street Journal drive-by. A board of directors or CEO reads something in the paper, and you get a phone call and says, okay, my hair's on fire, what should we do? So what advice do you give to CISOs to get in front of these kinds of stories and the inevitable, are we secure?
Yeah, I mean, it happens to all of us very frequently. And you think about, I'll rewind like 3 years ago. We had one of the biggest breaches of our times, not too far from here. I can't name the client. We are running into this war room and investigation. Nights and days were blurred for us, 20 plus hours every single day, in front of congressional hearing and board and then the C-suite. We were working with the CIO, and the CIO gets thanked by the board, by the Congress, actually invited to come and be part of one of the steering committee and task force. And the CIO and I talk about, what are they talking about? I just got breached. It's one of the biggest events that happened. So the reflection of that was because of this specific organization, what they were commending him on was his response, how he handled, how he managed. And it wasn't about just recognizing the sophistication of this. The board actually thanked him, how he contained and really remediated. And the notion that we got from one of the board members was, hey, if this was not a sophisticated event, we would not have partnered. If this was something 7 years ago, buffer overflow, SQL injection that you didn't take care of, because this was so sophisticated, they actually pardoned and thanked him the way he handled it. So I think the way the CIO led and the whole organization was so much proactively, with very specific, like quarterly briefings, all hands, talking to the business leaders, and they were really proactively controlling the agenda, because for this organization, security is one of the pillars that the organization won't function. So I think what we see is generally, golf course conversations. You talk about Wall Street Journal. That's another analogy I have. Board members talk at a golf course and so forth. Hey, what's the other company? And there you go. Your strategy changes after that golf course event. So I think for us as practitioners, for us as professionals, we have to be proactive. And I think board is hungry for data. So I think that's one of the elements that Jim talked about. They're looking for really good data. And so as a practitioner, as professionals, it's our job to make it really data-driven conversation with board, risk-based conversation with board, to really avoid those situations and stay true to the metrics.
Yeah. So Debbie, I want to jump to you. And so you probably have more skin in this game than anybody. As a CISO, you're talking to the board at least once a quarter. And you're probably preparing to talk to the board every day of every quarter. So what are some of the things that you do to educate and inform the board, both at your, both at the quarterly meetings, but as you go along? I mean, kind of to go along with what the question I just asked Vijay. How do you stay in front of these things with your board?
Yeah, we have an annual report that, from a regulation perspective, we are required to give. And what I do is, beginning 12 months before that report, I outline the topics that I will present to the board at every board meeting. So I make sure that as I get to the annual report, I'm not just, overwhelming them with this 64-page report of our entire program. So what we do is in February, we have a cyber dinner, right? So we will come together, we will talk about, threats on a clear web, the dark web, et cetera. And we'll have, a guest speaker come in. Interestingly enough, we actually pulled our board's dossiers. We actually looked at what they look like on the clear and dark web and showed them this is what you look like. And that spurned a dinner conversation around how that data is leveraged for nefarious purposes and how it can be inadvertently leveraged by people, maybe even not for nefarious purposes, but not necessarily how you intended for it to be used. So we sort of culminate and build up to this annual report. And in the annual report itself, to help them understand the regulation, we have a page that actually says, here's what the regulation says you need to know, and here's where you can find it in the report. So we try to make sure that we're talking to our board in very kitchen English terms. And then you mentioned what's going on in the industry with the different attacks. Whenever something occurs, whether it be at any of the, I guess, names that you hear in the press, we actually do an anatomy of an attack. And that is sort of an ad hoc. So when I do my annual calendar, I say, here are the things, here's the topics that we will cover. We'll cover identity, we'll cover data devaluation, we'll cover the annual report. But then I say, I'm going to come to you ad hoc if anything happens in the environment. So what we do with the attacks is we look at the different defensive layers and we say, here's what failed, right? Because we all know that this is not just one thing that failed. It's across the whole spectrum. And oh, by the way, here's where PNC stacks up against those particular areas. So here's where we're strong, here's where we're weak, and we're going to course correct and spend more attention on where we're weak because that was actively exploited. So we definitely have time for ad hoc conversations. So it's just very much a dynamic environment, but it's sort of, we plan for what we plan for, but then we also plan for interrupts. We're an interrupt-driven society, right? And we have to make sure that we have time for those very critical interrupt conversations. And then we have time for fun, too. We have a Cyber Fest that we invite our board to come. We invite them to sort of judge some of the different programs that are at it. We have an Open API Fest that's targeted around security. So we involve them in things like that as well, and I think that helps make it more of a conversation and less of a death by PowerPoint and annual report type of situation. But keeping it very conversational, I think, is really important.
I encourage you to come and see Debbie sometime today because she's doing some very innovative things with her board that I think we could all take some lessons from. So, Joe, let's step this up a little bit more strategic and a little less tactical. What are some of the critical cybersecurity issues you think the boards perhaps need to spend a little bit more time on today to understand better? Again, getting away from the tactical threats and vulnerabilities, but step it up a layer there.
So first I would say, this is so hard, right? Cybersecurity is so hard because of the asymmetric environment and the way that we have to protect so many different layers and scenarios. Therefore, governance is really, really hard. How can, governance is about wisdom. How can you have wisdom about an area that you don't understand? So we'll start with that. And I think Jim pointed out maybe some best practices that are being adopted by some companies that are furthest along. I think this issue of talking down to the board members about the technical part is kind of an abdication, right? So we have to crush that. We have to create the opportunity for wisdom and governance at the board level through education. And so when I think about it, I look at zooming out on some categories. I think maybe, benchmarking is for sure a great practice to have. So zooming out and seeing what are others doing in my vertical or in my horizontal scenario that matches like my size of company. But that's been stated. What I would introduce would be this concept of security portfolio management. There's been a ton of focus on security technologies, whiz-bang, algorithmic, probabilistic things that you don't understand typically. Not even people putting them in understand, and they have that relationship with their vendors. That can only do so much, right? You have to complement that. There's been a great, I think, trend in the industry towards monitoring and response as a complement to prevention, which we all know is never going to happen, right? So monitoring and response, I think, is a critical area. Governance, very self-serving. Governance is another area that I think is really important, getting back to the roots of really paying attention to who has access to what. It's hard to do. You have to decide, how do you want to prove every form of access according to every person's role based upon how they fit into the organization. And everything else on the exception basis, you have to figure out a process for that too. That's really hard. It means confronting the problem and spending the energy and the time to not bury your head in the sand and go do it. That's governance. The one I would add, maybe the biggest one is training. Like we know that all these attacks start with a phish to an unsuspecting user. They just have to get one person to click on one thing. That's all that. And if you talk to the guys that know, right? Not me. I'm not a practitioner. They just need one person to click on one link, and it typically comes in a phish that's increasingly very well engineered. And so, the emergence of training end users on what to spot, what the current things look like, what to look for, how to gauge whether something is a phish or not, and then giving them really good direction on where to go and what to do if they can't be sure. Right? To me, that would be that should be one of the number one focal points. Now, for a board, is understanding that portfolio and saying, okay, these are what we've got in motion here. I want you to be presenting me with data and progress and how you're balancing this versus pinning your hopes on prevention.
Yeah, that's a good message there. So, Brad, you work with a lot of CISOs, and back to my original point of what's that one item you discuss with your CISOs to help them move this conversation back up to the board, the security, instead of taking responsibility. I remember when I worked for Governor Schwarzenegger, and he said at one point that Mark is taking care of cybersecurity for us. And I remember thinking, wow, this is awesome. But in retrospect, it's like, I should have said, no, sir, actually it's your responsibility. I'm carrying it out for you.
Yeah.
So, but I think so how do you have that conversation with your CISOs?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things to look at there. I mean, I think from an accountability perspective, there's outside pressures, right? You've talked about a few of them already, high-profile attacks. You know, that's impacting financials, reputation. At the end of the day, it's impacting shareholder value, so the board has to be held accountable. You have the compliance mandates as well. They're becoming more prescriptive, I think, which is great. Penalties are getting higher. You have the pressure not just directly from the regulators, but your business partners requiring you to comply. So all these external pressures are great. And then there's the inside. Once you get inside the organization, sort of what do you do as a CISO, right? And this is where I think a lot of CISOs struggle, particularly those that are coming up from the technical routes, right? They're trying to step out of that business or technology speak and talking data and kind of talk more at the level that the board needs to. So what I tell them is it's very pragmatic, and I don't just say this because I'm a vendor and I want them to be nicer to the vendors, but what I say is, take a step back and take a look at how's that CISO role looked at within the organization, right? As Jim mentioned, I think people need to have CEO, very security-driven cultures, right? And that's up here where the CISO is looked at as a business partner. He's looked at as a strategist within the company, talking about new products and stuff coming to market. So is that where you're at, or is your company look at you more as a traditional CISO, right? Where I say it's more of a technologist, right? More of a policeman of systems, where you're there as a necessary evil, right? So looking over systems, making sure everyone's following proper policy and procedure to make sure you don't get an audit finding, right? So very two different dimensions here. And I think that to close that gap between the two of them, some of those external pressures help, right? So the board's being driven to close that gap a little bit. But how do you close the rest of that gap, right? For the CISO, how do you close that gap from the technologist and more of the policeman to being a partner in the business and a strategist? And so when I'm talking to a CISO, and again, coming from the vendor side, I say, well, you already know how to do this. Think about a vendor coming in to sell to you, right? And how do you deal with that vendor? When I walk into an account for the first time, I want to talk to the CISO and I want to talk to you about, hey, how we can be great partners together. I have all these solutions and I can be a business enabler, I can be a trusted partner for you. But I'm just walking in the door, right? I'm still down here, right? So they look at me as a technology vendor, maybe a set of features that they want to implement. So how do I close that gap? Well, I have some marketing and some stuff I can do ahead of time, external things that kind of close that gap. But the rest of that gap closure is on me and my sales team. So what I tell a CISO really is, what you really need to do is think about it like a sales and a relationship building process that you need to go through, right? You need to think about all the different players that you need to deal with. And you have to have the message, kind of like we do with our marketing message when we go in to talk to different companies. We have to make sure when we talk to you, Mr. CISO, we're talking in your language. We don't want to waste your time. You need to do the same thing. Empower your team to take that experience you already have dealing with us and project that internally now, right? So if you're dealing with technical guys, you talk with data. You're talking to business level guys and business leaders, you're talking with intelligence, and when you're talking to the board and so on, you talk with, as Jim mentioned, with stories. So you have to understand what's that level of communication that you need to talk to. And just like when we're talking to a CISO, in order for me to get to that CISO, I'm not going to build that relationship meeting once a year. I mean, that's not how you drive that relationship over time. I get to that relationship by working with this team, right? Because they're the ones talking to that CISO throughout the year. So I have to build those partnerships with the team. I have to prove the trust with the team. And that way, when I can actually get in front of the CISO, I have the right message. I have the support of all the different players that he trusts within the organization to support me going forward, right? And I think there is some challenges there for CISOs still, as you mentioned earlier. Some of the barriers and kind of getting that clear and concise message across, you're going to have some filters along the way. If you're reporting up through the audit team, for example, I think we were talking yesterday about how do you balance. If you're in front of the board, we're talking more about compliance, right? So if quarterly you're getting that message through the compliance team, how much of your innovation and your strategic thinking is making it through the compliance team to get to that board level, right? Versus really focusing on the audit findings, right? If you're reporting up through the CTO or the CIO, you can have conflicting priorities, right? You might be they're thinking about things like, migrating workloads to the cloud or DevOps and all these great things. So that's what they're focused on, launch dates, and they're focused on, driving revenue through these products, right? So you need to think about that in those terms. And if you start talking about, well, I have some concerns about that, what about implementing these, certain security restrictions, right? If it's going to put that project at jeopardy, they might. Sort of their objectives might overshadow some of your concerns in some way. So you got to be aware of what some of those filters are as well. So I think it's a selling process. You have to understand who the players are and really focus on having the right message at the right level at the right time.
Yeah, you reminded me, that sounds like the CISO's Dilemma. Working with the CEO and the CIO are very different conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Debbie, I'm going to go back and something that Jim had on the last slide, that you have to have the conversation around risk.
Yes.
Boards understand risk. They understand financial risk, competitive risk, compliance risk. They don't necessarily understand security risk. So how do you balance your message around risk and conveying the risk to your company without freaking these guys out?
It's a delicate conversation. And I just wanted to sort of build off your comments. One of the first things that I start with my board on is I really try to meet them where they are in terms of their business mind. So I really see security as in building trust in the brand as the ultimate brand differentiator. So being in the financial services industry, that connects with them. And then all of a sudden we have a common outcome, right? So I don't become a control function. I become somebody who's building trust in the brand. And that also helps make sure that I have a seat at the table at these board meetings. But when we're talking about risk, I think the key here is a consistent backdrop, right? And I make sure that we are real clear on our taxonomy. What's high risk, what's moderate risk, what's low risk, what is the quality of our risk management, what's the inherent risk, and then what's the residual risk. And I make sure that we stratify that so that I'm not distracting my board with something they don't need to be distracted with. And I'm making sure that when I'm sitting in front of them explaining something that requires their attention, it requires their attention for a reason, right? When we're talking about safeguarding data, here is why it is important for us to safeguard our customers' data. Here's where we have gaps in our control environment. Here's what we need to do to close them. And here's how that's going to reduce our residual risk. And you have to be real clear in those conversations. And that stratification is really important. So if you, in your firm, have different definitions and you guys are slinging around risk terms and you're not sort of consistent in your taxonomy, you're going to confuse your board and you will cry wolf and then you won't get the attention when you need it. So it is vital to make sure that you've got that stratification, that you're challenging how you're designating and quantifying and communicating that risk.
Hey Mark, I was just going to add.
Yeah, please jump in.
What Debbie just made a comment is actually an excellent point, because a lot of time is very subjective.
Yeah.
Risk is, there is an element of subjectivity, there is qualitative elements. We were down in Mexico at a very, very large manufacturing organization, OEM, and with the CFO, the CTO, the CISO, and we had just finished a very large global penetration test. And within 30 seconds, we communicated to the CFO and the COO who was there that based upon the last week's worth of work, we have no integrity in the quality of the data and the production that you're doing in the Mexico facility. So the regulators can shut you down. So the CFO and the COO literally jumped out of the chair. And they look at the CISO and the CTO. He's like, what the heck is this guy talking? And the CISO's reaction was, I've been trying to tell you for the last 18 months that give me money so I can fix some of these issues. So what sort of literally it was, tell me how much? That was the next question, the CFO. So the challenge as a practitioner for all of us in the industry has been, we have they're not communicated the risk in the right taxonomy, in the right language that the board and the senior executives understand. And the other element is a lot of subjectivity. So we got to really quantify. In our board conversations, 80% of the board is disappointed that they don't get forward-looking metrics. They don't get risk. They're not able to get right data to make risk-based decisions going forward, not looking backwards. So I think that's kind of as a practitioners, our job as an industry is to really provide them with that level of quantitative metrics that they can make the right decisions going forward. And it makes all of us kind of better in terms of execution.
So Vijay, you mentioned budget, you mentioned money. So one of the things that I've heard a lot over the past couple of years is boards are increasingly frustrated with this OpEx, CapEx issue. Is how long is this going to go on? How long are we going to spend money? I gave you a big pot of money to fix things last year. Why are you coming back for another big pot of money? How is this conversation? I mean, this is kind of an elegant conversation you have to have the board with expectation setting. It actually should have happened a decade ago, but I find that we're still. How do you deal with that with your customers?
Yeah, I mean it's never a fun conversation, right? So over the last, I would say, couple of years, I think we've all been in the industry for long enough. We're seeing there is a cyber fatigue. While the board and the executive management is like, hey, you're telling me I have at least Fortune 100 companies have at least 50 security tools, give or take, and not to mention other technology tools. You're telling me it's not a matter of if, it's when. So you're not giving me any reasonable assurance that I am protected. You have all sorts of regulatory pressures and the drivers, and then you come back and ask me for more money. So what comfort the CIO, CISO, whoever controls security function are giving me? So there is a cyber fatigue that we sense as well, and then some comments have been made by board and the executives like, hey, I may just go look for insurance and maybe do just the bare minimum. Like if you are not able to give me that level of protection or assurance, where should I make my bet? So they literally have some extreme conversations as well. Mm-hmm. So I think where it has come up as a better practice has been simplification. So I think Debbie even talked about having the right taxonomy, but simplify your stack, simplify your capabilities. I mean, all of us been to RSA conference and there are like 500 companies on the shop floor, on the expo floor. And here, yet we can't tell a board member that we are more safer than yesterday. Mm-hmm. So there's something inherently that we got to really challenge our capabilities, our stack, to say, reduce my attack surface. How do I simplify from a kill chain, how do I simplify my stack and say, from a risk perspective, this is my businesses, this is my crown jewels that I'm protecting, and here's my CapEx, OpEx that I need. And don't go back with surprises like aha moments for the board, and that doesn't really help them plan ahead. So we've seen kind of really organizations who have been very consistent in their messaging. Here are my 4 priorities that aligns with my top level ERM and business goals. Here's what my KRIs that I'm able to show you, and on a regular basis. That has helped them to control the conversations, as opposed to, hey, I need $5 million for patching, but patching for what? So there is no context behind it. Are you patching my number 1 customer systems, or you're patching my 1,001 customer systems? So there is no context. So you've got to really control that conversation, simplify the stack, and make sure you're ahead of the game.
Anybody else have any thoughts on this? This is probably the biggest issue that I hear from board members.
It's like quality. Remember what we did in the quality movement in manufacturing? We started measuring and we had consistency. You hit on it, Vijay, right? Consistency of what you're reporting on, and having evolved to something richer over time, but to stick with the things that are going to help you establish baselines and show progress. And the context thing, I think, is also just really critical, right? You can't ask for money outside of context. As a vendor, when someone has a new product idea and they say, can I put this on the roadmap? And you say, what has to go? You've got to give me some context. You have to help me. Oh, but we need this for our strategy.
Right.
I can't do it. Right? That's an analogy for vendors, right? That probably a lot of people can relate to.
So Brad, this actually leads into my next question then. The landscape is literally littered with companies that are providing security tools for everything imaginable. And I think of, you go to the vendor floor at RSA or Black Hat or any of the other things, and it's like, I think 99% of the companies on the floors are solving the same problem. So how do you work with CISOs and security teams to work with the vendor community, these thousands and thousands of companies out there, to drive better understanding and accountability up to the board? And it kind of goes back to the OpEx CapEx discussion. Is how do you bring this conversation up to the board that we need this, but we don't need this, or we need this and it's going to replace 4 other things? How do you have that conversation?
Right. Well, I think there's a few things. Come back to what Vijay mentioned. I think one is you have security layers in place today, so you have vendors in place today. And I think one of the challenges is how do you prove the return on the investment that you've already made, right? And that comes up a lot. And are you sure you're extracting as much value out of those tools as you can before you take a look at the next tool? So there's a few things that I would look at. One is, once you roll a solution out, right? How do you make sure that you continue to maximize the effectiveness of that product? You have a lot of turnover in the security teams, turnover on the ops side. So how do you make sure that these teams are trained up, understand the product, and are really using it the right way that it was meant to be used in the organization? And that's tough, right? So what's the right cadence to work with the vendor on making sure that they're touching you, coming out and talking to you, making sure people are educated, those sorts of things. So I think that's important, right? And then we'll talk about the reporting and think of it later on. But the other thing I think is as you build that more strategic relationship with your vendor is the security landscape's changing quite a bit, right? And so the other thing that's changing quite a bit is the vendors that you've selected. So what you need to do is when you're having those proactive discussions with your business, with various businesses in your environment, learning what are the new things that you're doing, what are the use cases you need to support next year with respect to operations. You need to be looking internally at your current investments and understanding, are these guys going to be able to do it for me, right? And so, for example, if I talked about earlier, if you're looking at doing some things around these cool things around access and DevOps and microservices and Docker and containers and all this stuff, all this craziness, right? Are you going to go out and buy more products to solve this stuff? Or you're going to take a step back and get ahead of that, understand those things are coming down the pipe in 12 to 18 months from an operational, you need to get these products and these services out. And then go back to your vendors and saying, here's the use cases, right? Can you guys solve these today? And if you can't, how are you going to help me solve these in the future, right? I need to know now. And if you can do it, great. If you can't do it, are you going to have that feature for me when I need it so I don't become critical path on the project for operations? Because if you don't have those conversations up front and push your vendors, right? As Joe mentioned, when we put features in products, we have to have validation. Why? We get the validation from the community telling us what to do. So if you're having those conversations and you're pushing them on getting these features in, then you won't be on that critical path, because that's the visibility you don't want with the board, right? Is I'd like to get this done, but the security teams, it's an anchor on me here. I can't get this product out because of this requirement. So then you end up with security teams that have some choices, right? You miss the deliverable from an operations perspective in some cases, which is not a good thing, right? You move ahead with some sort of some more risk than you'd like to, which you probably don't want to do, and you'll add that feature later or close that gap later, which you might not want to do. Or third, which could even be worse, as Vijay mentioned, you go buy another product to solve that specific use case for the specific condition. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, you end up with 50, 60, 200 different vendors supporting this little pockets of use cases that becomes unmanageable over time. And I think we see a lot of companies where that's happened, and then you have this realization, and I have to go through a rationalization period to go clean all this stuff up, right? So that's tough. So I think when you're out there and you're talking to the board and you have that relationship that I talked about earlier, where you're understanding the new products and services that you're trying to get out, and then you can talk to your vendors about how you're going to support those use cases. That'll allow you to decide whether or not those investments you've already made can solve it, or whether or not you have to extend the spend in some other product for some reason.
I would just add the best practice of actively pruning. So you alluded to it there, but I would just sort of emphasize the point. I see the most effective security shops have a very active effort to take technologies out and have the courage to say they made a mistake, even if they take one out before it's realized its full life and its return. And that's part of the active management of the portfolio. The portfolio has to be serving the broad collective set of things you're trying to accomplish. And as you said, the more you have, the harder it is to know whether you're achieving the mission or not. So pruning down all the time.
Yeah, and then a lot of it also comes down to reporting, right? As you mentioned earlier, how do I know that I'm in better security, my security posture is better today than it was last year, and how did I accomplish that? And what tools were used or what solutions were used to help me get there? You need to be able to draw that line.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I have many more questions, but we want to take some questions from the audience. So start thinking about that. Do we have microphones? Yes, we have microphones. So I'm going to ask Deb one question, and if anybody has questions, we'll take an audience question. Debbie, so we've already established that there's varying levels of cyber IQ and maturity on boards. What methods do you use to address those needs, and what are some of the things you do to educate your board?
Yeah, so, first and foremost, I feel like it's my job, right? I really feel like that's a key part of what I do. And on our board, we have a fantastic board, but we have everything from, somebody who would say to me, Debbie, why do you refer to these people as threat actors, to people who literally just went through the Carnegie Mellon board certification process. So, we've got the full spectrum. But what I do is I really try to make sure that I explain things in terms and in methods that meet them where they are. So when I explain what I call my programmatic focus around what I call sort of tip of the spear, I have 2 programmatic focus areas. So I don't have 99, I've got 2, right? And they are around identity, and it's around being able to confidently distinguish between customers and criminals, employees and insiders. And everything in my shop has an identity, including the security camera, right? Everything in my shop has an identity. So it's around identity management, and if you get that right, a lot of things sort of, don't need to be addressed, right? So if you do identity right, there's a lot of what I call cleaning up after the parade that doesn't need to occur. The second thing is this notion of data devaluation, making sure that data is only a valuable asset to the intended user at the point of intended use. So I keep these backdrop conversations because almost everything else that I talk about with my board docks into that. And what I just described, I could do in about 3 minutes, and the board understands. I'm not sitting there, going into technical nuances. We talk about vulnerability management, certainly. We'll make sure that we backdrop that in, conversations like our response to WannaCry, right? So this KRI this is that moment, so here we are dealing with WannaCry, which was largely a hygiene issue. Here's how we measure our hygiene, right? So we connect those dots, and we make sure that at every moment it's sort of both an educational moment, but also an opportunity for these brilliant business leaders to provide me guidance and feedback to help make sure that I'm on the right course for this firm. So if I don't put what I'm doing in terms that they can understand, I won't get the benefit of their guidance and feedback. And I've got real titans of industry in these conversations. And I want to make sure that I'm optimizing that time and that I can get their feedback into my program so I can make sure that it's the right program for this firm.
Great, and I'm sure there's 1,000 other things that we could think of that, ways that we can educate our board. Do we have any audience questions? No? Yes? Right over here? 2? Hang on.
Thank you. My question is, would you see a day where maybe, because we talked about OPEX, CAPEX, maybe there's a way to quantify and put a number at the board level so that a company knows how much they are spending for cybersecurity, the same way as we have metrics about marketing, about branding, about R&D, right? Even though it may not be a pure separate item, but you may know how much you are spending for training for security, how much you are spending for data, how much you are spending for identity management and things like that. And that way, this could be potentially a tool to monitor progress and explain why we have to invest in a continuous manner, not just, it's not a one-shot expense item.
So
I have thoughts. Go ahead.
yeah, so I'm happy to chime in. So at least for, I would say, around the Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies, it's a very good discipline they're already following in terms of, here's my, and again, I'm saying not all of them, but generally speaking, here's my top 5, business initiatives that I have. You're reporting in 10K. And what it means for the lines of business, and then how is cyber reporting and supporting those business goals, and here's what the dollars from a CapEx, OpEx, and the KRIs. So we have actually, some of the leading financial institutions have really gotten this down to a science. And which is, so if my goal is, I'm going to buy 3 more companies, I'm going to release, expand in Latin America, if I'm going to do some more, enter new markets with new disruptive products. So if these are my goals, they've really taken down, here's my business objectives I'm telling Wall Street, what down to the KPIs that from a security perspective that I have to support those business objectives, and what's my dollars. And actually they've decentralized some of the dollars. It's not just security owns every single line item. They have decentralized some of the run the business elements and down to the product teams, because it is not just security. So their accountability, shared accountability, and they have metrics that they're actually sharing CapEx and OpEx. One point I just wanted to share what Debbie said earlier, getting down to the science, is for CISOs and for practitioners, be very consistent in messaging. So it's very similar to what Debbie said, kind of the 2 pillars. I have another, kind of the CISO and the CRO. They have 4 pillars, but they're so consistent with that messaging. 4 pillars in terms of it supports the business objectives, here are metrics, and literally for 3 years he talks like that, and I'm amazed to see the board members and CEO, you ask, what's your cybersecurity objectives? Here are my 4 things. It was like wow, like he just being very consistent, not changing the taxonomy, not changing the dimensions and the strategy, but the regulators, very clear. And so CapEx, OpEx has been very much down to science, working with the finance team, and making sure it's not just security's responsibility for all CapEx, it's a shared responsibility in some of the lines of business. For example, product security. So it's like they are measuring like, hey, if a developer is having bad code, shouldn't the dev team own some of the responsibility for fixing and so forth? Why don't we kind of divide that and decentralize some of the execution remediation elements? So it's a shared responsibility, not a security's responsibility to go fix all bad code of the entire company.
Yeah, I would just say, add on to that. I think the larger the company gets, the more difficult it is to say, what is my cyber spend? Because it's distributed in so many ways, with people, process, and technology across all your business units, across the world. And then you also have to define what is cybersecurity. A cybersecurity tool for one organization may be a productivity tool for another part of the organization. So I think very sophisticated companies they've kind of put a bubble around that. It's not 100% effective, but that's a challenge. It's just a challenge.
Mark, there's also a principle here that something we're trying to achieve flies in the face of this, and that is if we want to immerse security in the business, associate it with the brand. I think a digital transformation just as being code for reinventing our customer engagement, right? We want security to go into the business context. Right. We want it to be upstream in design, not just of code, but of user experience, right? And business process. It goes away from being able to isolate it as a cost, and in fact, it makes it an intangible and a shared cost. So I think it's good to be very conscious of that as well. Remember the wars we had in IT, worrying about losing IT to the lines of business, and not having centralized control. Well, turns out that kind of was a good thing. It was probably happening for a natural reason. So figuring out how to operate in that capacity to be more impactful to the business makes you less of a cost and more of an element of the top line. So I'd be mindful of that too when you isolate.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. I think the other thing is not so much how much you're spending on cybersecurity, but what's the benefit of the spend on cybersecurity, right? And I think sometimes getting that quantifiable amount is difficult. I think one of the areas that I think the community could improve is, vendors can do a lot better job of translating all that raw data that's coming out of the products, right? So it's vulnerability data. You don't want to give, you can't go in with a phone book of data. So summarizing that data and getting intelligence around that data out of the product, right? So you can get that information on a more continuous basis. So whether it's scorecards and dashboards and Delta reports and training reports and those sorts of things, but providing intelligence out of these tools that you can provide more continuous feedback to the business on, just throughout the year. And I think the way to make that happen is that the companies have to make that a part of the selection criteria when they purchase software. Because I tell you, today they don't. Today they focus more on the control, not all of them, but a lot of them focus more on the control aspects, right? And they get the product in, then they're like, okay, how do I report on this? So you get to think through that stuff up front and make that more of a part of the selection process and drive organizations and vendors to add that kind of technology to their solution set. Really to try to do some of that heavy lifting, if you will, of translating for you.
Question over here. There's a mic right there.
Good morning, Bob Hyde with Lumina. Thank you. Bob Hyde with Lumina. We're talking about really how cybersecurity kind of cuts across the enterprise. And I'd be curious to understand your perspective, particularly you, Debbie, about how this really impacts the balance sheet. Because clearly it's not a profit center, but at the same time, there are, you use the terms, inherent risk, residual risk. Yeah. Certainly there's a benefit from all this. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think there's a huge benefit to all of this, and this is kind of why one of my focus areas is on identity. I think that the reduction of customer friction and the authentication processes is probably the next battleground in customer attraction for certainly a financial institution. So I think that's going to end up having, again, sort of a real brand differentiator. How measurable is that? I think that's going to be a little bit of a mystical element of what we do. But, my goal is to both reduce risk and increase our again, sort of our brand relative to this notion of trust. My mission for my function is #together building trust. And I could spend a long time on those three words, but together it's just not, so you mentioned, the CISO's responsibility, right? And we make sure that it's together. So it's both PNC and our customers, right? I can create, secure products, but my customers need to ensure that, they're practicing good hygiene, that they have, the latest patch on their OS, they don't have hijacked software, those types of things. So that's the together part. And building is, and I'm always interested in this financial conversation because security is something that started, the inception of banking. I mean, it started with bank robberies. That's kind of why I have, physical security. When I look at threat intelligence, I go back to I think the 1850s when Pinkerton started doing threat intelligence. And we've only been building on that since. And guess what? We're going to continue to build on that. So, the investment's never over. So for people, and unfortunately I'm one of them who like to check the box and be done, this isn't the role for you. This is something that we're going to continue to build on for the rest of our lives as long as there's, financial ecosystems. And we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and that's going to continue to evolve. And the threat vectors are going to continue to evolve. And then I have trust. And it's such an important word. Because again, as I mentioned, I want our customers to have trust in us. I want our employees to have trust in us. I want our shareholders to have trust. The communities that we serve to have trust in us, right? So, how measurable is all of that? I don't know. It's a little bit of a moonshot answer. I get that, but I do know that it's the right journey. And I know that I've got sort of very practical KPIs. I got the performance indicators, I got the risk indicators, I got my risk appetite statements. I know where I want to be. I know when I trigger a line. I know that there's consequence models, and we put those in action. So I think it's both a combination of that very tactical day-to-day view, and then just really understanding where we want to be as a brand. And anybody who's in marketing and gets that, sometimes that brand moment is sort of like that emotional connection. So we're really trying to build that, especially with my team who is working incredibly hard. Our job, I mean, it's it's thankless, and most, a really good day is quiet, and woohoo. But be able to light up that emotional connection with my team, with that customer experience is a real important part of helping them to continue to just really work hard and put the blood, sweat, and tears that they put into their role every day to protect the firm.
Well, we are out of time, so please join me in thanking our excellent panel.